With the advancement of technology, you can see a lot of beautiful close-up shots like these everywhere these days, what we know as macro photography. But what if you don't have one of those expensive cameras or smartphones, but still you want such effects on your photos? What if you want to transform some old photos into such static photography? Today, we'll be learning how to replicate macro photography and make the background objects blur while keeping the focus on the main object in photos. Moreover, we'll be looking at the use of Blur tool and Sharpen tool in Photoshop toolbar as we are continuing the Photoshop Basic series. Welcome to Webtrickshome. So, this is the image I'll be working on, and I must say it's very hard to find this kind of photos these days. You can see the entire area of the image sharp here. We'll be transforming it into one of those close-up shots taken by some advanced cameras. But before that, let's take a quick glance at the Blur tool in the tools bar right below the gradient tool. Click on it and you can see the Blur tool, Sharpen tool as well as Smudge tool in the same group. With the Blur tool selected, you can see the regular brush tool options on the options bar that we've already learned. The only option new over here is the strength option that defines the intensity of the blurriness on single stroke. Let's keep it to the highest value and paint over the object. And you can see how quickly the object gets blurred, right? And if you dropped it down to let's say 50%, you'll need to apply multiple strokes to get the same result. Alright, so let's have a look on how we can blur the background with the Blur tool. The first thing I'd like to do here is make two copies of the background layer so that we can work on it non-destructively. I'd like to keep the main object on a separate layer and the rest of the document in another layer. That way I can blur the rest of the objects without affecting the one I want to keep the focus on. Let's make a quick selection of the subject here. I'll use quick selection tool. You can use any tool you like. So the selection is done. Let's add a layer mask to it and rename it as main object. Now other areas except the main object is visible in this layer. So let's say this is distant object. Now all you need to do is select the Blur tool and paint over the areas you want to blur out. What I really like to do is leave the areas closer to the main object as it is so that the photograph looks more realistic. You can see the result here. So here you found out one of the easiest way to blur out backgrounds in Photoshop. You can play with the strength and make closer objects appear comparatively sharper than the distant ones. Basically, this is how the Blur tool works. But this is not how the Blur tool is used in Photoshop. We'll see where and how it is used. Before that, let's go through all those options in Photoshop you can use to blur out backgrounds. Alright, let's create another copy of the background layer. Now, all you need to do is go to the filter option on the main menu and go to the blur option. You can see a lot of blur filters over there. Let's go through each of them one by one. The first option is the field blur. Let's click on it and the Blur tool panel appears. You can see the iris blur as well as the tilt shift blur over here. The field blur blurs out the entire document evenly. You can play with the blur value and define how much blurriness you want to apply on the document. Moreover, you can click on the document and apply separate blur values in separate areas. Simply drag the white stripe inside the ring or drag the pointer on the panel to play with the blur value. Here you can see the final result with field blur. Let's see the iris blur then. And with the iris blur, you can keep the focus point inside the ring and then blur out the areas outside the ring evenly. You can click and drag the center point to move the ring. The area between the ring and the inner dots is the transitional area where the blur amount starts from 0% and reaches 100%. You can drag these inner dots inwards or outwards to increase or decrease the transition area. You can drag the ring to resize the pin, or click and drag the outer dots to reshape it. You can also add multiple pins while working with iris blur, just like the field blur. You can see the result here with iris blur. Let's see the tilt shift blur then. And with the tilt shift blur, you can replicate the macro photography effect easily to a great extent. This effect is also called shallow depth of field. If you can see the ground level on the document, tilt shift blur can be the best option to go with. The area between the two solid lines is the focal area that will remain sharp. You can increase or decrease the focal area by simply dragging the solid lines inward or outward. And the area between the solid line and the dotted line is the area where the transition occurs, starting from 0% blur at the solid line to 100% blur at the dotted line. Area beyond the dotted line is 100% blurred. You know how to move the pin and change the blur value now, right? Moreover, you can also add another pin and rotate it to get horizontal blur effect as well. Here you can also add distortion effect to the image. The default value is 0% here. Drag it to the right to add zoom effect on the blur, or drag it to the left to get the spin effect. By default, Photoshop applies distortion at the bottom area of the image. To add it to the top as well, you'll need to check the symmetric distortion option. You can see the result here. The most important thing here is that the image actually determines the blur filter that would look nice on it. Field blur, tilt shift blur, and lens blur are the most used ones though. Let's close this one and look at the other blur filters then. We can convert the image into smart object so that we can change the blur value later. Here you can see the average blur option. Click on it and you can see the image turned into a solid color. That would be the average color from the image. This option will help you to remove color cast caused by excessive lighting in your image, but that's not much used. You can simply add a labels adjustment layer on top of your background layer. Select one of the eyedropper tool to click on something from the document that should be gray, black or white in the image but isn't looking natural. First color picker is used to click on the black point, second one for a gray point, and the third one for the white point. You can see the color tone of the image shift once you click on any point, and that's what is called color casting. Then you have got the blur option, click on it, and you can see the application itself determines the blurriness of the image. You don't get any option to edit the values here, but you can work on the blending modes and opacity though. Then you have got the blur more option, and that will add further more blurriness to the image than the blur option, and you don't get any option to edit the values here too. Then you have got the box blur option, and with the box blur filter, the image is blurred using the average value of colors in each pixel with the area for color average defined as the radius value. Higher the radius, higher will be the area for color average and greater blur output. Then you have got the Gaussian blur, and with the Gaussian blur, you can add less detailed hazy blur effect to your image, and the amount of haziness depends upon the radius value. The lens blur can be used in smart objects, so let's leave it for a while and see the others. Here's the motion blur, and with this blur option, you can add motion effect to your image. It looks good on moving objects. Let's have a look. You can define the distance you want the objects to move to, and even the angle in which direction you want the object to move. Then you have got the radial blur. You can select either you want a spin or a zoom effect with the radial blur. Rather than working on the entire image, let's make a quick selection of one of the wheels and apply the blur there. I'll keep it on a separate layer, then apply the radial blur. And you can see the result. Then you have got the shape blur, and with the shape blur you can add blurriness using the selected shape from the options. All the objects within the image are covered by the selected shape, and the shape is blurred out. Higher the radius value, more detectable will be the shape. Then you have got the smart blur, and with the smart blur you can define the radius that defines the range around each pixel to be blurred out. The threshold defines the range of pixel colors to be determined to blur out. And you have got the quality and blending mode to select from. You can play with the options and try to achieve the desired effect. And finally, we've got the surface blur option that we have already talked about in the paint tool tutorial. This filter is generally used to reduce noise in the image. The image will be blurred out depending upon the radius value and the threshold while preserving the edges of the object. Pixels with average color value less than the threshold are excluded. And you can see the result here. Let's rasterize layer to see the lens blur. To work with the lens blur, we'll need to define the depth of field. That means we need to define which area of the image are closer and which area are in distance. Let's add a new blank layer and paint a black and white gradient on it. This is going to be the depth map for the lens blur filter. The black area will be the area in focus, while the white area will be the area to be blurred out. The gray area will be the area of transition. I'll add the focus object selection area in this layer. Hold Ctrl or Command key on your keyboard and click on the selection mask. And you can see the selection. Let's paint it with black so that the object stays in focus. Let's deselect it. Go to the Channels tab in the Layers panel and select one of the channels. Anyone will work fine. Let's duplicate it and name it as Depth Map. The layer is duplicated accidentally, but that won't affect the output. Let's select the background copy. We can hide both the gradient layers now. All we needed was the Depth Map channel. Go to Filter, Blur, Lens Blur. Choose the depth map in the depth map source. And you can see the blur effect on the preview. Play with the blur focal distance to define the blur strength. You can even invert the depth map. You can define the maximum amount of blurriness and the shape of iris blur. You can even define the roundness of the iris or rotate the shape of iris as well. You can also redefine the brightness and threshold for the brightness in the shallow area. You can also add noise to the output. You can even define the distribution of noise, either you want sharp noise or some hazy noise. You can also choose either you want gray noise or the noise be of similar color tone to the pixels. And you can see the result. So you found out how you can create blurred background in Photoshop. Now let's see the actual use of blur tool in Photoshop then. But before that, let's group all of these layers and lock them so that they don't interfere on the document area. Let's turn on the main object layer. Hold the Alt or Option key on your keyboard and click on the mask. Now you can see the mask on the document area. The edges of the main object are jagged, and that's where you can use the blur tool to smooth out the edges. Select the blur tool, define the strength you like, and simply paint over the edges. And you can see the edges start to appear blurred. Turn on the layer. And you can see the edges are smooth, right? If you think the edges are unnaturally smooth, you can select the sharpen tool and again load the mask at the document area and paint over. Make sure you check the protect detail option on to preserve the details on the edges. You can see the blurriness on the edges are reduced with the use of sharpen tool. Turn on the image and you can see the edges look quite sharp now. Let's make a copy of the background and paint over the image with the sharpen tool. And you can see the contrast is added to the object. Add a bit more strokes and you'll fry out the image details. Let's delete this layer. So, you found out that both blur tool and sharpen tool are best used with layer mask to smoothen or sharpen the edges. And if you want to add blur effects to your image, blur filter is the best way to go with. And with the sharpen tool, you can not only sharpen the edges, but also add contrast to the pixels. But overdoing it will damage the image, alright? Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching and please subscribe our channel for more videos. Thank you.